The pen scratched across the paper, and Eleanor Marsh signed a name that was no longer hers. Her brother-in-law watched from across the table, with the patient smile of a man who had already won. Outside the window, her husband's house, her house, 4 years of her life, stood solid and indifferent in the Cincinnati morning light. She set the pen down. She picked up her coat. She did not look back at the document, at the house, at the man still smiling. She walked to the stage depot and bought a ticket to a place called Ridge Creek, Montana, because it was the farthest name on the board, and she had run out of closer options. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. I promise you, she earns it. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit a rut, and Eleanor's shoulder slammed into the wooden frame hard enough to bruise. She straightened without making a sound. The man across from her, a cattle buyer from Butte, who had talked for the first 2 hours and then mercifully fallen asleep, did not stir. Outside, Montana Territory rolled past in shades of gray and gold. 400 miles from Cincinnati. 400 miles from a dining room table where she had signed away everything she had built with her own hands while a man watched and smiled. She pressed 2 fingers to the bruise forming on her shoulder and let the pain be simple and physical and hers. Ridge Creek appeared as a collection of wooden structures hunched against the wind at the base of a long slope. Eleanor saw through the window before the driver called it out. Small, deliberate. The kind of town that had decided to exist and was going to keep existing out of stubbornness rather than prosperity. She was the last one off the coach. She had learned, over 4 days of riding, that being last meant fewer eyes on you when your legs did not cooperate after hours of being folded into a corner. She stepped down, lifted her own trunk before the driver reached it, and set it in the dirt. The wind off the mountains was immediate and cold and completely without manners. "Ma'am," the driver looked at her trunk, then at her. "I can carry that to the—" "I have it," she said. She walked toward the lodging house with the trunk in one hand and her leather case pressed against her chest with the other. The sign above the porch read, "Calloway's Lodging and Board," in paint that had started to peel at the letter's edges. A woman stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching Eleanor come up the road with the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this and had decided to reserve judgment until she saw how the woman walked. Eleanor walked straight. She always walked straight. It was the one performance she had never been able to stop giving. "You're the Horne woman," the woman on the porch said. "Eleanor Marsh," Eleanor said. "Yes." "Ruth Calloway." She did not move to help with the trunk. Eleanor appreciated that. "You look like 4 days on a stagecoach." "That's accurate. Come inside." The front room of Calloway's was warm from a wood stove that had been burning long enough to take the mean edge off the cold. Eleanor set her trunk down, kept the leather case in her lap when she sat, and looked at the table in front of her with the focused attention of someone deciding whether to trust a surface before putting weight on it. Ruth set a plate of cold biscuits on the table without ceremony and sat down across from her. "Eat something. You're pale." Eleanor ate one biscuit, then another. She had not eaten since a brief stop in Butte the morning before, and her body had apparently decided that dignity could wait. "How long were you married?" Ruth asked. Eleanor looked up. Ruth was watching her with the direct, unornamented attention of a woman who had asked this question before and was not going to dress it up. 4 years. He's been gone 7 months? 7 months and 11 days. And the family moved on the estate before the burial? It was not a question. Eleanor set down the biscuit. His brother had the paperwork prepared before my husband drew his last breath. I found that out from the solicitor, who told me apologetically, and then billed me for the meeting. She paused. The house transferred within 2 weeks, The accounts were frozen inside of 5 days. I was given 3 weeks to vacate. Ruth absorbed this without visible reaction, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was simply how Ruth processed information. Completely, and without performing shock she did not feel. And the rumors that I had been unfaithful. Eleanor's voice remained level. That my grief was theater. That I had married poorly and revealed my character by the end of it. She looked at Ruth steadily. His brother needed people to believe I was dishonest. He needed that to be the story they remembered when anyone questioned the terms of the will. And they believed him. It was easier than the alternative. She said it simply. Believing a woman when her account contradicts a respected man's account is genuinely inconvenient for most people. Ruth picked up her coffee cup. The letter of reference in that case. She nodded toward the leather bag in Eleanor's lap. Forged. Eleanor stilled. I'm not asking to shame you, Ruth said. I've done harder things than forge a letter to keep myself housed and fed. I'm asking because I want to understand how bad it actually got. A long pause. Yes, Eleanor said. I forged it. All right. Ruth said it the way people say, all right, when they mean understood and moving on. Caleb Horne will be here within the hour. I want you to know who you're meeting before he walks through the door. Please. Ruth turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. He is direct to the point that some people call it cold. He is not cold. He lost his wife and their child 7 years ago. The birth went wrong, and neither of them survived the night. And since then, he has expressed every single feeling he has had through physical labor, which means he has built an extraordinary amount of fencing. She set the cup down. He is honest, in a way that will feel strange after what you've been living with. He will not say things he does not mean, and he will not soften things to manage your reaction. If that sounds like relief to you, that's the right instinct. Eleanor looked at her carefully. And if it sounds like a threat? Then you've been managed by kind words for too long to trust the absence of them yet. Ruth met her eyes. Which is it? A beat of silence. Relief, Eleanor said. Terrifying relief, but relief. Ruth gave a short nod. Good. They heard the boots on the porch before the door opened, a steady, unhurried tread that did not slow or hesitate before entering. He came through the door, and the room did not shrink for it. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and he moved like a man who had learned to take up only the space he actually needed. Dark hair, gray at the temples. A jaw set with a kind of permanent patience. He had his hat off before he fully crossed the threshold. His eyes found Eleanor immediately and held. They were dark and direct, and they looked at her in a way she had almost forgotten was possible, as though she were a person he was genuinely trying to see, rather than a variable he was trying to assess. Mrs. Marsh, he said, low voice, unhurried. Eleanor stood. Mr. Horne. He crossed to the table and extended his hand. She shook it. Brief, firm, released without lingering. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Ruth stood, said, I have work, and disappeared with the precision of a woman who had been timing that exit. Caleb set his hat on the table. He looked at Eleanor and did not speak immediately, and she did not fill the silence. And she had the distinct impression that this, too, was something. That they were both already learning the shape of each other in the quiet before words. I want to be straight with you, he said. My letters were straight, and I don't intend to change that now you're here. I'm counting on it, Eleanor said. He looked at her briefly. Something shifted, slight recognition. The ranch is 40 working acres. Cattle, horses, a dog who believes he is in charge, and a house that is clean, but not comfortable in the way you're probably accustomed to. He paused. When I said I needed someone willing to work, I meant it straight. Not willing to endure, willing to work. There is a difference, she agreed. I need a partner who tells me the truth of things, including when she's struggling. I've had enough quiet suffering in that house to last my lifetime. Something moved through his voice on that sentence, a fault line he had learned to walk carefully. I don't want more of it coming in through the front door. Eleanor set her hands flat on the table. Mr. Horne, I want to be equally straight with you. Go ahead. I came here because I had no remaining options I was willing to accept. She did not lower her eyes. My husband has been dead 7 months. His family took the house, the accounts, and my name along with them. I have $43, 4 years of account ledgers I kept without credit or acknowledgement, and the letter of reference that is, she held his gaze without flinching, not legitimate. Silence. She pushed through it. I'm telling you this now rather than later, because you said you need honesty, and I intend to offer it from the first moment rather than the convenient one. If that changes your assessment of this arrangement, I need to know before your wagon takes me 40 acres from the nearest town. Caleb was very still. His eyes did not move from her face. The ledgers, he said. You kept them yourself. She had expected anger, suspicion, the careful retreat of a man recalculating. She had not expected that. 4 years, quarterly summaries, monthly expense tracking, vendor contracts, payroll for 11 employees. She paused. My husband preferred the word, I not appear in connection with any of it. My accounts are 3 years behind proper recording. Caleb said it with the flat delivery of a man confessing something that has been irritating him for 3 years. I know what I have and what I owe, but I cannot prove either of it on paper. Anyone who wanted to challenge my land claim right now could do it with paperwork and win. Eleanor looked at him. Is that a theoretical concern or a current one? Current. He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table. A man named Garrett Finch works for a land company out of Chicago. They've been acquiring smaller holdings in this valley for 2 years. They want a corridor of land, mine and 2 neighboring ranches, to sell to the railway at a margin that would make a lesser man's eyes water. He's made me 2 written offers, both legal, both written by someone who counts on the recipient not reading carefully enough. Do you still have them? In the house. I want to read them tonight. Something in Caleb's expression shifted. Not surprise, but recalibration. The slight adjustment of a man revising an assumption. All right, he said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, the letter of reference. I'm not going to address it. Eleanor waited. What I'm going to address is this. He kept his eyes level on hers. You rode 400 miles alone. You walked into a stranger's town with $43 and forged credentials. And you sat down at this table and told me the truth of it before I could find out any other way. He paused. That's not the behavior of a woman I need to distrust. That's the behavior of a woman who has decided honesty is the only currency she has left, and she's going to spend it straight. Eleanor's throat tightened. You don't have to pretend with me, he said quietly. Not here. Not in front of me. Not ever. On my land. She pressed her lips together. She had made a decision on the stagecoach outside of Butte that she was finished crying. She intended to hold to it. Understood, she said. Steady. He nodded once and stood, reaching for his hat. At the door he stopped with one hand on the frame and turned back. His eyes were direct and unhurried, and held something that was not quite gentleness, but was built from the same material. "Whatever they told people about you in Cincinnati," he said, "it followed you 400 miles. A beat. It stops at the edge of my property." He walked out. Eleanor sat without moving for a full 30 seconds. Then she picked up her coffee cup and noticed that her hands, which had been trembling in some register or another since the morning she signed that document in Cincinnati, were still. Ruth appeared from the back room with the timing of a woman who had been listening through the wall and was not embarrassed about it. She refilled Eleanor's cup and sat back down. "Well," Eleanor said. "He meant it," Ruth said. "Every word. That's the thing about Caleb Horne that takes some getting used to. He means everything he says, and nothing he doesn't. Which is disorienting if you've spent time around men who operate the other way." "It is disorienting," Eleanor admitted. "It feels like a trap." "I know," Ruth looked at her directly. "It isn't." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the leather case in her lap. 4 years of account columns. 4 years of her own precise handwriting, recording a life that had been built on her labor and credited to someone else's name. She had taken it the night before she left Cincinnati. The one thing she had allowed herself to take. The one proof that she had existed and worked and mattered inside those 4 walls, even when no one said so. "Ruth," she looked up, "when Finch comes, and I believe he will come soon, if the situation is as Caleb described, he's going to look at this ranch and see a man alone, with disorganized records, and a mail-order wife who arrived last Tuesday with a forged letter." She held Ruth's gaze. "He's going to believe that's a weakness." Ruth studied her. "Is he wrong?" "He's wrong about the records," Eleanor said. "Within 2 weeks, they will be in better shape than anything Finch's company has on file." She paused. "And he's wrong about me." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country as one. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe he is." The wagon was waiting outside when Eleanor stepped onto the porch. Scout, brown and white, enormous with enthusiasm, launched himself at her from the wagon bed and pushed his nose hard against her arm. She startled, held still, then brought her hand up carefully and rested it on his head. His tail became a separate organism. Caleb was already holding the reins. He did not move to help her up. She swung into the seat herself. Ruth stood on the porch. As the wagon began to move, she said, without raising her voice, "Eleanor." Eleanor looked back. "Middle of the night. Middle of a blizzard." Ruth held her eyes. "You come to this porch." Eleanor held her gaze until the wagon rounded the bend and the lodging house disappeared from view. They rode in silence that was not uncomfortable. The land opened around them, wide and pale and cold, the sky pressing down with the particular weight of October in the mountains. Eleanor watched it and did not shrink from it. "Tell me about the eastern boundary," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "What do you want to know?" "Where Finch's acquisition begins, what the railway corridor requires, what it would cost him to reroute if your land were unavailable." She turned to look at him. "I want to understand the full shape of it." He studied the road ahead. Then, slowly, he started talking. She listened with the focused, cataloging attention she had spent 4 years hiding in a Cincinnati house. Every number, every name, every legal mechanism he described imprecisely, she filed away to find the precise term for later. By the time the ranch came into view over the low rise, the house solid, the barn behind it, fencing stretching out in 3 directions across the land. She had the basic architecture of Finch's strategy clear in her mind, and 3 specific vulnerabilities she intended to examine in the written offers that night. "It's not much," Caleb said, looking at the house. "It's standing," Eleanor said. "Right now, that's the only qualification that matters to me." He helped her down without being asked to. A single firm grip, released the moment her feet found the ground. Inside, the house was simple and clean. A fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, shelves of books that surprised her. Not many, but chosen carefully, the spines worn with real use. He showed her the room at the back. Narrow bed, clean linens, a hook on the wall. On the windowsill, a single dried wildflower in a cracked cup, tilted slightly toward the last light. Eleanor looked at it for a moment. "I didn't put it there," Caleb said from the doorway. "Found it when I cleaned the room. Didn't see the point of moving it." She set her leather case on the table and turned to face him. "I want to be clear about one thing," she said. "Go ahead." "I am not fragile." She said it without heat, without performance, the way she might state a fact about the weather. "I know I arrived here on paper, looking like someone who needs rescuing. $43 in a forged letter, and a dead husband and a family that burned my letters at the reading of his will." She held his gaze. "I am the woman who kept those men's business running for 4 years without a title or a wage. I am the woman who read Finch's contract language and understood in the first 30 seconds of you describing it what he is trying to do." She paused. "I am careful. Careful is not the same as weak. I need you to know the difference." Caleb looked at her for a long moment in the doorway. "I know the difference," he said quietly. "I've been waiting a long time for careful." He turned. "I'll get the contracts." She listened to his boots down the hallway. She looked at the wildflower on the windowsill, dried and still upright, tilted toward a light that had long since moved on. She opened her leather case. She laid her ledgers on the table and smoothed the first page with the flat of her palm. She picked up her pen. Garrett Finch did not yet know her name. He did not know that the disorganized ranch he was planning to dismantle on paper had just acquired the one thing it had been missing. He did not know that the woman sitting at the backroom table in the fading October light had spent 4 years learning exactly how men like him worked. From the inside, in precise columns, in ink that did not lie. Eleanor Marsh had arrived hollow. She had signed away her name in Cincinnati and ridden 400 miles to a place she had chosen with her eyes closed. But she was here. Her hands were steady. Her pen was moving. And for the first time in 4 years, the work she was doing was entirely, completely, and irrevocably her own. The contracts were worse than she had expected. Eleanor sat at the backroom table with the 2 documents spread flat in front of her, and Caleb's lamp pulled close, and she read each page twice, once for the surface meaning, and once for what the language was designed to obscure. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the house in long, slow pulses. Scout had settled at her feet without asking permission. She had not told him to move. Caleb sat across from her at the same table, not watching her read, but not pretending to be elsewhere either. He had a piece of harness leather in his hands that he was working with a small tool, methodical and quiet, the way a man works when he wants to be present without being intrusive. She finished the second document and set it down. "He's not buying land," she said. Caleb looked up. "He's buying time." She turned the second contract to face him and pressed her finger to a clause midway down the second page. "This language here, contingent upon survey completion and territorial registration. That's not standard purchase language. That's a mechanism to hold the property in legal ambiguity for 18 to 24 months, while the railway commits to the corridor route. Once the railway commits, the land value triples. He pays you today's price and collects tomorrow's profit. Caleb set down the harness. He leaned forward and looked at the clause without touching the paper. I read that as a delay in payment. That's what it's written to look like. She pulled the first contract alongside it. Look at the same section in the first offer. He revised it between the two. The first version was cleaner. You might have caught it. The second buries the same mechanism inside 3 subordinate clauses and a paragraph about survey costs that has nothing to do with anything. She looked at him directly. He revised it because someone almost caught it. Possibly you. Caleb was very still. I asked him to clarify that section, he said slowly. He said it was standard territorial language. It is not standard territorial language. No, he said. I didn't think so. But I couldn't say exactly why, and I had no one to... He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. I had no one. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She did not offer comfort. He did not seem to want it, and she respected that too much to manufacture it. You have the letters he sent with the offers? In the tin box on the shelf. She retrieved it, sat back down, and went through the letters with the same systematic attention. Caleb watched her work. He had the expression of a man recalibrating. Not uncomfortably, but genuinely. The way a person adjusts when reality turns out to be different from the shape they had prepared for. He'll come back, Eleanor said without looking up from the third letter. Soon. The railway company's survey team is scheduled to move through this valley in the spring. That's what this reference to the March timeline means. He needs your signature before the survey, because after the survey, the land value is public record and he can't lowball you with a straight face. How long do we have? She checked the date on the most recent letter. He wrote this 6 weeks ago. He'll be patient for another few weeks, and then he'll appear in person. She looked up. When he does, do not let him inside this house. Caleb looked at her steadily. That's direct. He's better in enclosed spaces. Men like him, men who use language as their primary instrument, they are better when they can control the environment. Outside, in the open, on your land, the advantage shifts. She held his gaze. This is your land. Make him feel that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You know men like him. It was not quite a question. I was married to one, she said. A quieter version. Less financially ambitious. More personally controlling. Same mechanism. The language that sounds like one thing and means another. The revision of terms after you've already agreed in principle. The use of your own uncertainty against you. She set the letter down. I spent 4 years learning to read the gap between what was said and what was meant. I did not enjoy the education, but I am apparently keeping it. Caleb picked up the harness again. He did not speak immediately, and she had learned, in the span of an evening, that this was not disengagement. It was how he thought. He processed in the quiet, and then spoke from the result rather than from the middle. My wife, he said finally, without looking up from the leather. She was the one who handled the business side of things. She had a mind for it, faster than mine, more organized. He worked the tool in a slow, even stroke. When she died, I just kept the land going. Numbers, records, contracts. I let it go because every time I sat down to do it, it was her handwriting in the old ledgers, and I couldn't... He stopped. Finch came along 2 years later, and I think he knew, somehow, what kind of shape the records were in. Men like that always know where the soft ground is. Eleanor listened without filling the space when he finished. She was learning that about him too. That he said what he meant and then stopped. And that the stopping was the period, not a pause waiting for response. "The records are not going to be soft ground for much longer," she said. He looked up. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. "Everything you have, receipts, tallies, whatever you've written on whatever surface you could find. I'll build you 3 years of clean records that would hold up in a territorial court." She paused. "And when Finch comes, he is going to find that the woman who answered a marriage advertisement and arrived with a forged letter of reference has built a paper wall he cannot get through." Caleb looked at her across the table in the lamplight and said nothing for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. She blinked. "Why what?" "Why does it matter to you? This land, these records. You've been here 6 hours. Eleanor looked down at the contracts in front of her. It was a fair question. She took it seriously. "Because Garrett Finch is the same project as my brother-in-law," she said slowly. "Different scale, same principle. Find a person who has built something real, find the gap in their paperwork, and take it from them, using the tools they do not understand well enough to fight with." She looked up. "I understand those tools. I could not use them to save my own house because the law was arranged against me before I knew to fight. I can use them here." She paused. "And because you told me it doesn't follow me onto your land. What was done to me in Cincinnati," her voice was even. "I don't offer loyalty cheaply or quickly. But I know what it is worth when someone earns it." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he set the harness leather on the table and stood. "There are 3 crates of papers in the barn," he said. "I'll bring them in tomorrow morning." "All of them," she said. "All of them." He banked the fire before he went to bed. She was still at the table when he said goodnight from the hallway. And she was still at the table an hour later when the house went quiet around her, and the only sounds were the wind and Scout's breathing at her feet, and the scratch of her own pen beginning the first new column. She did not sleep much. That was not new. Sleep had been a negotiation since Cincinnati, arriving in fragments and departing without warning. But the quality of the wakefulness was different here. It was not the vigilant, listening alertness of a woman waiting for the shape of a problem she could not name. It was the clean, purposeful wakefulness of someone in the middle of work that mattered. By the time the sky through the window went from black to gray, she had completed a preliminary inventory of every document Caleb had left on the table. She had begun a master ledger page with column headers. She had written 4 specific questions she needed answered to understand the property's legal boundaries, and she had identified the exact clause in Finch's second contract that, if challenged in the right venue with the right documentation, could void the agreement entirely. She heard him in the barn before she heard him in the house. The low, patient sounds of a man beginning work before the light fully cooperated. Scout lifted his head, wagged once, and put his head back down. Caleb came in with cold on his coat and wood smoke on his hands from the barn stove, and stopped when he saw her still at the table. "You sleep?" "Some," she said, which was approximately true. He looked at the expanded array of documents she had organized into 4 distinct groups on the table. He looked at the new ledger page with its clean column headers. He looked at her. "You've been at this all night." "I've been productive all night. There's a difference." He almost smiled. It did not fully arrive, but it came close. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she filed away as significant. He hung his coat and put water on without being asked, and brought 2 cups to the table. He sat down and looked at the question list she had written. "These 4 things," he said. "The Eastern Boundary Survey. When was it last done, and is there a recorded copy? The water rights on the creek. They're not mentioned in either of Finch's offers, which means either they're not legally attached to the property, or he's hoping you won't notice that they should be. The original land grant documentation. I have it. I need to see it. It's in the same tin box. She reached for the box. He put his hand out and opened it himself and found the grant document folded in thirds at the bottom. He unfolded it and passed it across. She spread it flat and read it, and then went very still. Caleb. Yeah. She looked up. The original grant includes a 30-foot easement along the creek's entire length on your property. She turned the document to face him and pointed. This language here. Do you understand what that means in the context of the railway corridor? He leaned in and read it. She watched his face as he read and saw the moment he understood. A slight sharpening. A stillness that was different from his usual stillness. The railway can't use the corridor without creek access, he said slowly. Not without a separate negotiation for easement rights that are currently attached to your land grant, recorded in the territorial office, and not mentioned once in either of Finch's purchase offers. She held his gaze. He either doesn't know this is here, which I doubt, or he was counting on you not knowing. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the careful quiet of two people learning each other's rhythms. Something more charged. If I hold the easement, Caleb said, the railway needs me at the table. Not Finch, not the land company. Me. You don't have to sell anything, Eleanor said. You could negotiate an easement lease. Annual income, your land intact, and Finch's entire acquisition strategy collapses because the corridor is worthless to the railway without your cooperation. She paused. But this only works if your records are clean, your boundary documentation is current, and you have legal representation that isn't intimidated by a Chicago land company. There's a lawyer in Billings, he said. He helped with a property dispute 2 years back. Caleb paused. He's honest. Write to him today. I will. He looked at her across the table with the focused, direct attention she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things he took seriously. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. Yes, I placed that advertisement because the land needed more than one person to hold it. His voice was steady and unhurried. I told myself that was the reason. Practical, straightforward. He looked down at the grant document on the table. I think I also placed it because I had spent 7 years being alone with what I'd lost, and I was tired. Not lonely, the way people mean when they say lonely. Just, he paused, finding the word with the care of a man who rarely spent time looking for them. Tired of the weight being only mine to carry. Eleanor looked at him. I did not expect this, he said, meaning the contracts, meaning the ledgers, meaning the creek easement that had just reordered the entire shape of the threat against his land. He was not saying she had exceeded expectations in the way people say it to flatter. He was saying it plain, the way he said everything, as a fact he had just confirmed and was now reporting accurately. I didn't expect it either, she said, which was also plain and also true. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee. She picked up her pen. They worked through the morning that way. Him bringing the crates from the barn, one by one, and her sorting through each layer of accumulated paper with the systematic attention of a woman who had built this exact skill in the worst possible school. Receipts organized by year, expenditures separated from income, the rough tallies Caleb had kept on loose paper, in a handwriting that was unexpectedly clear and precise, cross-referenced against her preliminary columns. He did not hover. He brought things and answered questions when she asked them, and went back to his work when she stopped asking. The division was natural and without discussion, and it fit together the way two different tools fit together, when they are the right shapes for the same job. At midday, Ruth arrived. She came without warning, knocking once and opening the door without waiting, which Eleanor was already beginning to understand was simply how Ruth moved through the world. She carried a wrapped bundle of food and set it on the table without ceremony, assessed the organized document situation with a sweep of her eyes, and looked at Caleb. "Finch was in town this morning," she said. Eleanor's pen stopped. Caleb set down the crate he was carrying. "What did he want?" "Coffee," he said. "Information, obviously." Ruth unwrapped the bundle. Bread, salt meat, 2 early apples, and sat down. "He was asking about the new wife. Friendly questions. The kind of friendly questions that are dressed up hostile questions." She looked at Eleanor directly. "He knows your name. He knows you came from Cincinnati. He knows your husband's family name." Eleanor felt the cold move through her, familiar and navigable. "He did research before I arrived," she said. "Or he does research on everyone connected to properties he's targeting. Probably both." "He said," Ruth paused, choosing the phrasing carefully, "that he had heard the Horne Ranch had recently come into some difficulty, that he hoped everything was stable, that his offer remained open if circumstances became pressing." "He said that in the general store," Caleb said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something underneath it had changed considerably. In front of Mrs. Harper, the Delacroix boy, and 2 men passing through whose names I didn't catch. Ruth met his eyes. He wanted it heard. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She was already looking at him. "He's moved his timeline up," she said. "Coming to town personally, making public statements. He doesn't do that when he thinks he has time. He does that when he thinks someone is about to realize something he doesn't want them to realize." She held Caleb's gaze. "He knows about the spring survey. He may know about the creek easement. Or he's worried we're about to find it." "We found it this morning," Caleb said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "We did." Ruth looked between them. Something settled in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a woman who had taken a calculated risk and was watching it prove out. "Write to the lawyer in Billings today," she said to Caleb. "That was already decided," Eleanor said. Ruth looked at her. "Good." She stood and buttoned her coat. At the door, she turned back. "He'll come to the property next. Not today. He'll wait a few days to seem unhurried. But he'll come." She looked at Eleanor. "When he does, he stays outside," Eleanor said. Ruth smiled. It was brief and without warmth toward the subject, but entirely warm in its direction. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Both of you." She left. The house settled back into its working quiet. Eleanor looked at the table, the contracts, the grant document, the growing columns of the new ledger. 4 years of Cincinnati training laid out in careful rows for the first time in service of something that was actually hers to defend. Caleb stood by the window, looking out at the land. His land. The creek line just visible in the distance, carrying water rights that Garrett Finch had been counting on him not knowing to count. "Caleb," Eleanor said. He turned. "He's going to come here, and he's going to look at this ranch and try to find the weakest point." She held his gaze steadily. "I need you to understand something about men like him. He is going to look at me and see the weakest point." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That is going to be his mistake," Eleanor said. "But only if we let him make it." Caleb looked at her for a long moment in the midday light, at the woman sitting straight-backed at his table, with his family's land documents spread in front of her, and a pen in her hand, and her eyes entirely clear, carrying no performance and no apology, only the clean, forward-facing attention of someone who has finally found work that is equal to what they are capable of. "Let him come," he said quietly. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass in long, slow waves, and the creek caught the light and held it, and 40 acres of Montana territory waited, patient and solid, for whatever came next. Garrett Finch arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after Ruth's warning, which was exactly how long Eleanor had predicted he would wait. She was at the table when she heard the horse on the road. A single rider moving at a deliberate pace, not hurried, not hesitant. The pace of a man who had decided how this visit would go before he left town. She set down her pen, closed the ledger she was working in, and stood. Through the front window she could see him clearly. A man in his mid-40s, well dressed for the territory, in a coat that had been made somewhere with better tailors than Billings, riding a horse that cost more than most of the ranches he was trying to acquire. His posture was easy and open and entirely constructed. She had known men who sat a horse exactly that way. Her husband's brother sat a horse exactly that way. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at her with a smile that had been calibrated to land just below warm. Friendly enough to disarm, controlled enough to signal that the friendliness was a choice he could revoke. "Mrs. Horne," he said. "Mrs. Marsh," Eleanor said. "I kept my name." A slight pause. He adjusted. "Of course, my apologies. Is your husband available?" "He's working," she said. She stayed in the doorway. She did not invite him in. She did not step out to meet him. She held the threshold the way Caleb had taught her, without knowing he was teaching her, simply by existing on his land, with his particular quality of stillness. "Is there something I can help you with?" Finch swung down from the horse, with the practiced ease of a man who wanted the movement to look casual. He looped the reins over the fence post with the assumption of someone accustomed to making himself at home in other people's yards. "I've been meaning to introduce myself," he said, walking toward her. "Garrett Finch. I have some interests in the valley. Land, investment, development opportunities." He stopped at a comfortable conversational distance, not too close, calibrated. "I've had correspondence with your husband over the past year." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've read it." Another slight adjustment behind his eyes. "Thorough," he said, and made it sound like a compliment and a note at the same time. "Mr. Finch." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "My husband will be back from the north pasture within the hour. You're welcome to wait by the fence." She paused one beat. "I'll let him know you came." Finch looked at her. He had a particular way of looking, a surface pleasantness with something assessing moving underneath it, like a river that looked calm from the bank. "I'd hate to trouble him if it's not necessary. Some of what I wanted to discuss is fairly straightforward. The offers he's received are still open, and with the spring coming on, the timing is worth considering." He tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps you and I could speak briefly, since you've read the correspondence." "We could," Eleanor said, "but anything we speak about briefly will be spoken about again in full when my husband is present. So you would be covering the same ground twice." She let that sit for a moment. "I wouldn't want to waste your time." He looked at her with the focused attention of a man recalculating. She had the distinct impression he was revising several assumptions simultaneously. "You're from Cincinnati," he said. "I am." "Your late husband was in business there." "He was." "I may have done some business with associates of his family." He said it the way people drop names they want you to feel the weight of. "The Marsh interests are fairly well known in certain circles." Eleanor felt the cold move through her, precise and familiar, and did not let it arrive on her face. "The Marsh family interests are well known, yes," she said calmly. "Though I should tell you, in the interest of the honesty you'll find is practiced consistently on this property, that my relationship with that family ended at the reading of my husband's will. Anything they may have told you or your associates about me should be understood in that context." Finch looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, a different smile than the first one, smaller and more genuine, which was in some ways more dangerous. "You're direct," he said. "My husband values it," she said. "So do I." "Then I'll be direct as well." He clasped his hands in front of him, a gesture of reasonableness. "The railway survey comes through this valley in March. After that survey is complete and the corridor route is confirmed, the land values in this specific stretch will increase significantly. The offers I've made to Mr. Horne reflect current value, which is fair market today. After March, I won't be in a position to offer what I'm offering now." He held her gaze with the patient confidence of someone delivering information they believe the other person cannot adequately counter. "I'd hate for a family just establishing itself to miss a real opportunity." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "That's very considerate," she said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The survey in March, does it cover water rights as well as land boundaries?" The pause was brief, less than a second. But Eleanor had spent 4 years reading the pauses of men who used language as their primary weapon, and she caught it clean. "Surveys are fairly comprehensive," he said. "Because I've been reviewing the original land grant documentation," she said, "and there's a recorded easement along the creek that runs the full length of the eastern boundary, 30 feet, registered at the territorial office in 1871. She watched his face with the calm, focused attention of a woman holding a very specific card and waiting to see which way the other player moved. "I imagine the survey team will document that as well." Finch was very still. "I mention it," Eleanor continued, her voice entirely pleasant, "because the offers we receive don't reference the water rights at all," which seemed like an oversight worth noting, since any development along the corridor would presumably require creek access. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture she had copied without realizing it from Ruth. "Wouldn't you agree?" The silence stretched for 4 full seconds. Then Finch said, "Where did you find that documentation?" "In the tin box on the shelf," she said, "where my husband keeps his records." Finch looked at her with an expression that had finally dropped its calibration entirely. What was underneath was not anger. It was the focused, cold attention of a man who had just identified an obstacle he had not previously mapped. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I think your husband and I should speak directly." "I agree completely," she said. "He'll be back within the hour." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse without another word, unhitched the reins, and mounted with the controlled, careful movements of a man who was deciding something. He looked back at her once from the saddle. "You've been thorough," he said again. "Yes," she said, "I have." He rode out. Eleanor stood in the doorway until the sound of the horse faded completely. Then she let out a slow, steady breath and pressed the heel of her hand against the doorframe and held it there for a moment. Not trembling, not overcome, just releasing a pressure that had been building since she heard the horse on the road. Scout appeared from around the side of the house and pressed his entire head against her knee. "Good dog," she said. She heard Caleb before she saw him. His boots on the path from the north field, his stride longer than usual, which she had learned meant he had seen something from a distance and come in faster without wanting to look like he'd come in faster. He rounded the barn and saw her in the doorway, and his eyes swept the yard once, noting the fresh horse tracks of the fence post, and then came back to her face. "Finch," she said. He crossed the remaining distance in 8 steps. "How long ago?" 5 minutes. He rode back toward town." She stepped aside and let him through the door and closed it behind them. "He came alone. He stayed outside." Caleb turned. He looked at her with the direct, focused attention she had seen him use on problems he was taking seriously. except that it was turned fully on her now. And it was not just problem assessment. It was something else underneath that he was not yet naming. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. And then, because she had promised him honesty, and she intended to keep that promise precisely. "My hands were cold the entire time. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I did not show either of those things, but I want you to know they were there." He looked at her for a moment. "That's not weakness," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not reporting it as weakness. I'm reporting it because you asked, and we agreed on honesty." She moved back to the table and sat down. "He knows about the easement. Or he knew before he came and wanted to see if I'd found it, which amounts to the same thing. The pause when I mentioned it was," she chose the word carefully, "revealing." Caleb sat across from her. "What did he say?" "He said the survey would be comprehensive. He said the offers still stand. He referenced the Marsh family name, which was meant to unsettle me." She looked at Caleb directly. "He's done research. He knows what happened in Cincinnati. Probably not the details, but the outline. He was testing whether I could be rattled using it." "Could you?" "No," she said. "Not by him." She paused. "By other things, possibly. Not by Garrett Finch." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He'll go to the lawyer. He'll pull the territorial records himself to verify the easement and figure out how to work around it." "He won't be able to work around a recorded grant easement," Eleanor said. "Not legally. He may try to argue that the easement is inactive or that use rights have lapsed. There are some territorial precedents for that argument, which is why I want the lawyer in Billings to file a formal easement declaration before the March survey. Get it on record as active and maintained." She paused. "Did you write to him this week?" "Sent it Tuesday," Caleb said. "I should have an answer by end of next week." "Good." She looked at the ledger in front of her. "The records will be in order by then. I want to send a full accounting summary with the second letter, so he understands the complete financial picture before Finch gets to him first." Caleb looked at her across the table. He had the expression of a man who kept finding that the floor was more solid than he expected. A recurring, quiet surprise that had started to look something like wonder. "You thought of that," he said. "Finch will contact the lawyer," she said, "or someone representing the land company will. They want to know who Caleb Horne has advising him, and whether it's worth the trouble of a legal contest. If the lawyer already has a clean, complete financial picture from our side, before that contact happens, it changes the shape of the conversation." "How do you know he'll contact the lawyer?" "Because that's what I would do," she said simply, "if I were him." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not the almost smile from the morning, but something closer. Something that had a different quality. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "When Margaret died," he stopped, started again. He said his wife's name the way people say names they have kept carefully stored, bringing them out infrequently to make sure they are still intact. "When she died, the hardest part wasn't the grief. The grief was straightforward. It had a shape." He kept his eyes on the table. "The hardest part was that she was the only person I had ever been completely honest with. And after she was gone, I didn't have anywhere to put the honest version of things. So I stopped having one." Eleanor did not move or speak. "I don't tell people that," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He looked up. "I'm telling you." The house held that for a moment. Outside, Scout had settled against the front door. The wind was in the grass, and the creek was doing what the creek did, and the October light was going amber through the window and sitting on the table between them. "I had the opposite problem," Eleanor said finally. I had things I was honest about internally, constantly. I kept track of everything, every discrepancy, every inconsistency, every moment the version of events I was being told didn't match the version I had witnessed. I kept meticulous internal records. She paused. But I had no one to tell them to, so they just... She looked at the ledgers on the table. Piled up. Like these. Caleb watched her. I think that is what happened to my handwriting, she said, and it came out almost dry, almost not serious. And she was surprised to hear it, because she had not made anything like a joke in 7 months, and this was the closest she had come. Caleb looked at her. The almost smile arrived fully this time, brief, real, and entirely without performance. It crossed his face and was gone, but it had been there, and she had seen it, and something between them shifted with a weight and a warmth that neither of them commented on. The shift lasted exactly as long as it took for hoofbeats to return on the road. Not 1 rider, 3. Caleb was at the window in 4 steps. Eleanor was right behind him. Through the glass they could see Finch returning, and beside him a man in a town suit she didn't recognize. And behind both of them, riding slightly apart, Thomas Greer, who owned the ranch directly north of Caleb's property, and whose land Finch also wanted for the corridor. He went straight to Greer, Eleanor said. He knew I'd have more standing to contest the easement if Greer supported the creek rights argument. Caleb's jaw had set. Greer's been wavering on the offer for 6 months. Finch has been working him. What's Greer's situation? Older. No family left on the land. His son went to Denver and didn't come back. Caleb watched the 3 riders approach. He's tired, and Finch knows it. Eleanor looked at the 3 men slowing in the yard. Finch's second visit, same day, with reinforcements. That was not patience. That was pressure. That was a man who had gone back to town, made 2 fast stops, and returned inside of 90 minutes because something had shifted in his calculation, and he wanted to reestablish momentum before she and Caleb had time to build more of their own. He's scared, she said. Caleb looked at her. Of the easement, yes, but more than that. She watched Finch dismount in the yard with his calibrated casualness. He came back the same day. Men like him do not move that fast unless they've realized the window is closing. She turned to Caleb. Go out. I'll stay inside. Let him see that you are not alone in there, that there's a light on and someone at the table. But don't bring me into it yet. Let him think he has the meeting he wanted. Caleb looked at her steadily. And then, she said, you ask him to put his revised position in writing. Tonight, if possible. Tell him you need time to review it with me. She paused. Use the word advisor. Caleb looked at her with something that was absolutely not the almost smile, and was something deeper and more considered. You are my advisor, he said. I know, she said. I want him to know it too, but in the right order. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he took his hat from the hook, settled it, and opened the front door. Eleanor moved to the table. She opened the ledger to a fresh column page, picked up her pen, and held it ready. Through the window, she could see Caleb walk out to meet Finch in the yard, steady and unhurried, moving across his own land with the particular authority of a man who had been standing on it for 15 years and intended to stand on it for 15 more. She heard Finch's opening words, friendly and measured, and heard Caleb's response, 4 words, quiet and direct, and watched the shape of the conversation shift in real time from something Finch was controlling to something he was no longer controlling. She looked down at the fresh ledger page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote Finch's name. She wrote the time of the first visit and the time of the second, and the names of the two men he had brought with him. She wrote what had been said and what had not been said, and what the gap between those two things meant. She had kept meticulous internal records for 4 years, with nowhere to put them. She had somewhere to put them now. Outside, Caleb's voice was steady and even, and entirely without fear. And Eleanor Marsh sat at the table in the lamplight, with her pen moving in clean, certain columns, and the two of them held the line together. Him at the yard's edge, with his boots on his own ground. Her at the table, with her pen on her own page. And Garrett Finch, for the first time in 2 years of working this valley, found himself standing in front of a door that would not open for him, regardless of which way he tried the handle. Finch did not put anything in writing that evening. He had stood in the yard with his two companions and talked for 20 minutes in the careful, circling way of a man trying to locate an opening that had been closed before he arrived. Caleb had answered each approach with the flat, patient directness that Eleanor was beginning to understand was not stubbornness. It was simply the way he occupied space when he had decided something. He did not argue. He did not elaborate. He answered what was asked and offered nothing beyond it. And every time Finch tried to expand the conversation into territory of his own choosing, Caleb brought it back to the same single point. Put it in writing. Finch had left without doing so. Thomas Greer had not spoken once during the entire exchange. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard and watched with the expression of a man attending a meeting he was not sure he had chosen to attend. And when Finch finally turned his horse to leave, Greer lingered for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the house, at the lit window, at the shape of Eleanor visible through the glass, before following. Eleanor had noted the 3 seconds. She noted most things. That night, after Caleb came back inside and they sat at the table with cold coffee and the last of Ruth's bread, she said, "Greer is the variable." Caleb pulled his chair out and sat heavily, the way a man sits when the weight is not physical. "He's a good man," he said. "He's just tired." "I know," she said. "That's why he's the variable. Good men who are tired are easier to move than bad men who are alert." She looked at the note she had made during the yard conversation. "Finch brought him today for a reason. He wanted you to see that Greer was already in the room, that the decision was already being made around you." "Was it?" "No," she said, "but Greer doesn't know that yet." She looked up. "I want to meet him." Caleb looked at her. "Greer, before Finch gets to him again. If Greer understands what the easement means, that the railway needs our cooperation regardless of what he decides to do with his own land, it changes the leverage he has in any negotiation with the land company." She paused. "He may not know he has options beyond selling." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He won't want to talk business with a woman he doesn't know." "Then we don't talk business," she said. "We bring food, and we sit on his porch, and you talk about cattle, and I listen, and at some point the conversation finds its way to where it needs to go." She held Caleb's gaze evenly. "I'm from Cincinnati. I attended 8 years of my husband's business dinners and never said a word that was officially on record. I know how to move a conversation without appearing to move it." Caleb studied her. "That's a particular skill," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I acquired it under circumstances I would not recommend, but I have it, and it is available." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. She had learned by now that his long looks were not discomfort. They were thought made visible, the external sign of a man taking something seriously enough to fully examine it before responding. "All right," he said. "We go Saturday." They went Saturday. Ruth sent a covered dish without being asked, as if she had known they were going before they told her, which Eleanor was beginning to suspect was simply how Ruth operated, at a consistent half-step ahead of events, managing them by appearing only to observe them. Thomas Greer's ranch was smaller than Caleb's and older, the house weathered to a deep silver, the barn patched in two places with wood that didn't match, the fence lines straight and well-maintained, in a way that spoke of a man who still cared about the work, even when the work was harder than it used to be. He was on the porch when they arrived, a man of about 60, with white hair and a face that had been through enough seasons to look like the land itself, worn and permanent, and not unkind. He watched them come up the road with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read arrivals. "Caleb," he said. "Tom." Caleb stepped down from the wagon and offered his hand. They shook with the brief, solid grip of men who had been neighbors long enough that the gesture was shorthand for a longer history. "You know my wife?" Greer looked at Eleanor with a careful neutrality. "Seen her in town," he said. "Heard some things." "I imagine you have," Eleanor said pleasantly, stepping down herself without waiting. She carried Ruth's dish and extended it toward him with the simple directness of a woman delivering something that needed no explanation. "From us? Or from Finch? Or from both?" Greer looked at the dish. He looked at her. Something shifted slightly in the careful neutrality. Not warmth, but the First Amendment toward it. He took the dish. "Come up," he said. They sat on the porch, the three of them, and talked for a while about nothing important. The late-season grass, the creek level, a section of Greer's northern fence that had given way in last month's wind, and whether it was worth replacing before winter or after. Caleb talked easily and without performance, which Eleanor had noticed was one of his most disarming qualities. He was genuinely interested in the things he asked about, and people felt that, and it made them open in ways that calculated friendliness never could. Eleanor listened. She asked 2 questions, both about the ranch. Nothing about Finch, nothing about the corridor, nothing about the easement. She let Greer look at her sideways 3 or 4 times while he was talking to Caleb, and she met each look with the neutral, attentive expression of a woman who had nothing to prove and no particular agenda, which was the most honest expression she had worn in years, and also, she recognized, the most strategically useful. After an hour, Greer said, "Finch came to see me Wednesday." Caleb nodded. "I heard. Said you'd found something in the land records, something about the creek." Greer's voice was careful. "Said it was complicated." "He described it as complicated," Eleanor said, "because, from his position, it is." She kept her voice conversational, the way she might discuss the weather. "From your position, and from ours, it's fairly straightforward." Greer looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "What does that mean?" Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "The easement on Caleb's property means the railway cannot use the corridor without negotiating creek access separately, regardless of what happens with the land purchases. They need Caleb at the table." She paused. "What most people don't know yet, because the survey hasn't been completed, is that the creek runs through your property as well, and the original territorial water rights in this valley were granted collectively to the ranches along the creek's length." She looked at him steadily. "Which means they need you at the table too." Greer was very still. "Finch didn't mention that." "No," Eleanor said. "He wouldn't." Silence on the porch. A hawk turned slow circles above the north field. Greer looked at his hands. "I was going to sell," he said. It came out quietly, like a confession. "Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't see the other side of staying." He looked at Caleb. "My son's not coming back. I can't work this land alone much longer. And Finch, he made it sound like the only question was when, not whether." "That's what he does," Caleb said. His voice was quiet and without judgment. "He makes it sound like the decision's already been made." "It wasn't," Eleanor said. "It isn't." She looked at Greer carefully. "You have a water right that a railway company needs. That is not a man with no options. That is a man who hasn't yet been told what his options actually are." She paused. "There is a lawyer in Billings, honest, no connection to the land company. Caleb has already written to him. If you want, your name can be in that letter." Greer looked at her for a long moment. The careful neutrality was fully gone now. In its place was something raw, the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight in a direction he hadn't chosen, and was being told for the first time that he could set it down and pick it up again differently. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You've been here 2 weeks." Eleanor looked at him directly. "Because someone should have told me what my options were before I signed a document I didn't have to sign," she said. "And because the same kind of man who took my house is trying to take yours. And I have the tools to help, and I'm going to use them." Greer held her gaze. Then he looked at Caleb. "She always talked this straight?" "Every day," Caleb said. "You get used to it." Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same territory. The sound of a man exhaling a weight he had been holding, without realizing how long he had been holding it. "Put my name in the letter," he said. The ride home was quiet in the way that felt full rather than empty. The late afternoon light was going long and gold across the land, and Scout was asleep in the wagon bed, and Caleb drove without rushing, the way he did most things, with a patience that had nothing passive in it. "He'll hold," Eleanor said after a while. "I think so," Caleb agreed. "Finch is going to find out about the meeting. He'll have someone in town who tells him things." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "When he does, he'll move to the next stage, which is making the legal contest look expensive enough that it isn't worth pursuing. He'll hint at delays, at costs, at the territorial court process being slow and uncertain." She paused. "He's going to try to make the fight seem harder than the surrender." "Is the fight hard?" Caleb asked. "Harder than doing nothing," she said honestly. "Less hard than losing the land." She turned to look at him. "The lawyer will know what the actual costs and timelines look like. I don't want to guess at numbers I'm not certain of. But the easement documentation is clean, and the water rights precedent in the territory is on our side." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you it's simple. I'm going to tell you it's winnable." He glanced at her. "There's a difference." "You taught me that," she said, in so many words. He looked at the road ahead. Something moved through his expression, quiet and private, and not quite contained. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about what you said, about keeping internal records with nowhere to put them." She waited. "I did the same thing," he said. "Different kind. Not numbers, just—" He paused, finding the words with the care he always used for things that mattered. "Things I noticed, things I thought, things that seemed worth keeping track of, but had no place to go once Margaret was gone." He kept his eyes on the road. "I started putting them into the fencing." Eleanor looked at him. "Every time something was too big to hold, I'd go fix a fence line." He said it simply, without self-consciousness. "I've got the best maintained fence in the valley. Greer told me once that my fencing was ambitious." I didn't explain. Eleanor looked at the fence lines running alongside the road, straight and solid, and more extensive than any working ranch of this size strictly required. 400 yards of careful, meticulous work that had nothing to do with cattle. "That's not so different from Ledger's," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "No," he said, "I guess it isn't." The house appeared over the rise, and something in Eleanor's chest did the thing it had started doing 2 days in. A small, involuntary settling, like a compass needle finding north. She had not yet permitted herself to examine that feeling closely. She examined most things closely. She was giving this one room to exist without immediate analysis. They had barely unhitched the horses when Ruth appeared on the road on foot, which was unusual enough that both of them turned. She walked with purpose, but not panic. She had a letter in her hand. "This came on the afternoon stage," she said when she reached them. She held it out to Caleb. "From the Billings lawyer. That was faster than expected." Caleb took it and opened it on the spot. Eleanor did not look over his shoulder. She waited, watching his face. He read it through twice, which she knew meant the first reading had contained something he needed to verify. "He's heard of Finch," Caleb said. Eleanor was very still. "Professionally. There was a case in Helena 2 years ago. A land company acquisition that went to territorial court over similar easement language." He looked up. The company lost. Finch was the acquisition agent. He handed her the letter. She read it quickly. The lawyer's handwriting was compact and precise, and she liked him immediately for it. He laid out 3 specific legal arguments, referenced 2 territorial precedents, and offered a preliminary opinion that the easement documentation as described was strong enough to force a renegotiation of any corridor agreement at minimum. He asked for the full records at earliest convenience. He mentioned, at the end, that he was familiar with the land company's methods, and that if the water rights situation was as described, they were looking at something considerably larger than a single property dispute. Eleanor looked up from the letter. "He thinks Finch has been doing this across multiple properties?" she said. "Not just this valley?" "That's what I read," Caleb said. Ruth, who had been standing quietly, said, "If there are other ranchers in the same position, they have the same water rights argument available to them," Eleanor said. "The creek runs through 4 properties before it leaves the valley." She looked at Caleb. "Write back tonight. Send him everything, the full records, Finch's 2 offers, the grant documentation, the notes on the second visit." She paused. "And ask him whether a collective filing from multiple landowners is possible." Caleb looked at her. "You want to go wider." "Finch came here expecting to find a man alone, with disorganized records and a new wife who would tell him to take the offer," Eleanor said. "I want him to find out that what he actually walked into was a valley that now knows what it has." Ruth looked at her for a moment, with the expression Eleanor had come to recognize. Not quite approval, because Ruth did not traffic in approval, but the particular look of a woman who had been watching something she expected and was satisfied to see it arrive on schedule. "I'll heat water for coffee," Ruth said, turning toward the house. "You'll be up late." They were up late. The lamp burned past midnight, while Eleanor organized the complete documentation package, and Caleb wrote 2 letters. One to the Billings lawyer with the full records enclosed, and one to the 2 other creek-adjacent ranchers in the valley, straightforward and plain, explaining what they had found and what it might mean, and inviting them to write to the lawyer if they chose. He let Eleanor read both letters before he sealed them. She made 2 small adjustments to the legal language in the first, and none to the second. "The second letter is good," she said. "It's plain," he said. "That's why it's good." She folded the first letter and placed it with the documentation. "Plain is what people trust. Complicated is what people fear." Caleb looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low, and the house had settled into its deep nighttime quiet, and they had been working side by side for 4 hours with the easy, unself-conscious rhythm of people who had stopped negotiating the space between them and simply started sharing it. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer straight." "When have I answered any other way?" she said, the almost smile. "Are you staying?" She held his gaze. It was not a question about Montana, or about the ranch, or about Garrett Finch and the spring survey, and the corridor of land that 3 families were now, quietly and collectively, preparing to hold. It was a question underneath all of those things. The question that had been present since the day she stepped off the stagecoach, dry-eyed and hollow, and sat in Ruth's kitchen and ate 3 biscuits and told the truth before she had been asked to. She thought about Cincinnati, the document she had signed, the pen scratching across paper in a dining room where the decision had been made before she entered. She thought about the stage depot and the farthest name on the board and 400 miles of Montana sky pressing down on a woman deciding, mile by mile, whether hollow could become something else. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go." I made peace with that answer in the first week. She held his gaze steadily. "I'm staying because this is the first place I have been in 4 years where the work I do is mine, where the words I say are heard, where the person across the table looks at me and sees what is actually there." She paused. "I'm staying because I choose to, and I haven't chosen something for myself in a very long time." Caleb was still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same way he had covered it that first night in the lamplight, firm and warm and without performance. "I know the difference," he said quietly, "between a woman who stays because she has to and a woman who stays because she means to." She turned her hand under his and held it. "I know you do," she said. Outside, the wind came across the valley in a long, clean sweep, moving through the creek grass and the fence lines, and the 40 acres of Montana land that was not going anywhere, that had deep water rights and clean records, and 2 people at a table in the lamplight who had found, without planning to find it, the particular steadiness that comes from choosing to stand on the same ground. The letter from the Billings lawyer arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Caleb sent the full documentation package, and it was longer than the first one. Eleanor read it standing at the table before she had taken her coat off. Caleb watched her face instead of the letter. He had learned that her face was a faster and more accurate document than most things written on paper. He watched her read through the first page, then the second, and he saw the moment she reached whatever she had been hoping to find, because her expression did not change, but something underneath it went very still, in the specific way of a person setting down a weight they have been carrying at a controlled height for a long time. She set the letter on the table. She smoothed it flat with both hands. "He filed the easement declaration," she said. "When?" "Last week. It's on record at the territorial office as of November 4th. She looked up. "Finch's company was notified as a matter of procedure because of their pending acquisition interest. Which means they know." She paused. "And the 2 other ranchers on the creek, Henderson and the parish widow, both wrote to him. Both are represented." Caleb absorbed this. All 4 properties. All 4. She picked up the second page. He also found what he was looking for in the Helena precedent. The same land company, different acquisition agent, but the same legal structure. Tried to file a corridor easement claim in 1876 without landowner consent. The territorial court ruled that recorded water rights constitute a property interest that cannot be bypassed by a third-party railway agreement. She looked at him directly. "Finch cannot complete this transaction without our signatures. Any of ours. One holdout, and the corridor is not viable." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to walk away," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "He's going to come back with a better offer, and language designed to look like a concession while actually preserving his margin." She set the letter down. "But the conversation has changed. We're not 4 separate ranchers he can approach individually and isolate. We're 4 landowners with collective water rights, shared legal representation, and a recorded easement that his own company's lawyers have now seen. She paused. He knows what he walked into. He just doesn't know how to walk back out yet. What does the lawyer recommend? That we wait. She almost smiled at that. He says Finch will make contact within 2 weeks with a revised proposal. He wants to see the proposal before we respond to anything. He also says, she checked the letter, that if the railway company itself makes direct contact, bypassing Finch entirely, we should consider that a significant development. Caleb looked at her. Because it means the railway is not happy with Finch. Because it means the railway has found out that their corridor agent has been acquiring land at prices well below what they will need to pay to actually secure easement access, she said. Which means Finch's margin, the difference between what he pays us and what he charges the railway, is smaller than he represented to them. She paused. There may be a reason Finch works quickly and quietly. He may have promises to keep to his employers that his methods have been quietly undermining. Caleb sat down slowly. He put his hands flat on the table. So he's in trouble with both sides. Potentially, she said. I don't want to move on that assumption until we have something more definitive. But I want to be ready if it proves true. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. Eleanor, he said, when this is done, when the lawyer has done what the lawyer needs to do, and the railway has sorted out what they need to sort out, and Finch has gone back to Chicago, or wherever men like him go when a valley stops cooperating. He paused, choosing his words with a careful deliberateness she had come to love. What do you want? She looked at him. It was such a plain question. It was the plainest question she had been asked in years. Perhaps the plainest question she had ever been asked by a man who was asking it, and actually waiting to hear the answer. I want to teach, she said, properly. Ruth has been sending children to the table in the afternoons, and I've been working with them informally. But I want to do it with intention. Ridge Creek doesn't have a school teacher, and the children are doing their letters on whatever scraps of paper their parents can spare. She paused. And I want the books, the records. I want what I built in the last 4 weeks to continue. I want to be the person who manages the business side of this ranch, because I am good at it, and because it matters, and because I am done doing work that matters without it being called by my name. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then that's what it is, he said simply. You don't need to think about it. I thought about it the second week you were here, he said. I just needed you to say it first. She stared at him. The second week? You reorganized the barn accounts on a Tuesday when I hadn't asked you to, he said. You found a billing discrepancy from 1875 that had been sitting in that crate for 3 years, and you corrected it and put it back without saying a word about it. He held her gaze with a steady, unhurried directness that was simply how he inhabited the world. A woman who does that kind of work in silence, because she's been trained not to claim it, is not a woman who should be working in silence. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She would not, she had decided. She held to it. She would not cry. But the feeling that moved through her was not grief's cousin. It was something she did not have a precise word for. Something that lived in the region of being fully, accurately, finally seen. Caleb, she said. Yeah? I need to tell you something I have not yet told you. He waited. The night before I left Cincinnati, she said, after I had packed the leather case and arranged for the trunk and decided that I was going, and it was final, I stood in the hallway of the house that was no longer mine, and I thought about every room in it. She kept her eyes on his. 4 years of my life in those rooms. 4 years of work. And I felt, she paused, nothing that I recognized as grief. Not for the house. Not for the man. Nothing that looked the way I had been told loss was supposed to look. She looked down at her hands briefly, then back up. "I thought something was wrong with me," she said. "I thought the absence of that particular grief was a flaw, a coldness. Another item in my brother-in-law's accounting of my failures as a woman and a wife." She paused. "What I understand now, what I have understood slowly, in pieces, over the past 4 weeks, is that you cannot grieve a life that was not yours. You can only grieve the years you spent maintaining it." She held his gaze steadily. "I was not cold. I was just already gone." Caleb was very still. "I am not already gone from here," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the brief, firm grip of their first handshake, not the covering gesture of the evenings at the lamp. He held her hand the way a person holds something they intend to keep, and the distinction was as clear and unambiguous as anything he had ever said to her. "I know," he said quietly. "I can tell the difference." They heard the horse on the road before Scout had time to announce it, which meant the rider was moving fast. Eleanor was at the window in 3 steps. The horse was gray, the rider unfamiliar. Not Finch's posture, not Finch's coat, not the deliberate ease of a man managing impressions. This was a rider who had somewhere to be. "He's coming here," Caleb said from behind her. The man pulled up at the gate and called out before he dismounted. "Mr. Horne?" Caleb went to the door. "Yeah. Message from Billings." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Lawyer said, urgent." Caleb took the envelope, thanked him, and closed the door. Eleanor was already standing in the middle of the room. He opened it and read it, and this time she watched his face go through 3 separate expressions in 10 seconds. Surprise, then something that looked like grim satisfaction, then a long, steadying exhale. He handed it to her. She read it in 40 seconds. The railway company had made direct contact with the lawyer the previous day. They were not pleased with Finch. The word the lawyer used was significantly, as in significantly misrepresented the acquisition status of the corridor properties. The railway wanted to negotiate directly with the landowners. They were prepared to discuss easement leases rather than outright purchase. They wanted a meeting before the December survey team arrived. And Garrett Finch, the letter noted at the bottom, had quietly resigned from the land company's employment 4 days prior. Eleanor set the letter on the table. "He's gone," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Did you see that coming?" "I saw that something was wrong with his position on both sides," she said. "I did not predict the timing." She was quiet for a moment. "He knew. When I mentioned the easement on his first visit, he knew then that the acquisition was going to unravel. He spent 3 weeks trying to salvage it, and when he couldn't, he left before the railway could make it official." She looked at the letter. "Men like him always leave before the accounting arrives." She sat down slowly. The sensation moving through her was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable. The particular feeling of a problem you have worked hard and carefully that is resolved along the lines of the work, rather than in spite of it. "The meeting with the railway," she said. "I'll write to the lawyer today. Tell him all 4 landowners need to be present, or none of us meet." She looked up at Caleb. "Collective, the same way we filed." "I'll tell him." Ruth came that afternoon, as Ruth tended to come when things had happened, with precise timing and no particular explanation for how she had known. She read the lawyer's letter at the kitchen table while Eleanor put water on, and Caleb leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and Scout circulated between all 3 of them, looking for acknowledgement. Ruth set the letter down. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at Caleb. She picked up her coffee cup and was quiet for a moment in the deliberate way of a woman gathering something she wanted to say correctly. "I have lived in this valley for 22 years, she said. I have watched 3 families lose their land to men who dressed it up in paperwork and patience. I could not stop any of them because I did not know what to stop." She paused. "I knew what was happening. I did not know the mechanism." She looked at Eleanor directly. "You knew the mechanism." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I knew one version of it, from the inside. Caleb knew the land. Greer knew the history. Henderson knew which way the creek ran in spring flood. The parish widow knew her husband's original survey records better than anyone." She paused. "None of us could have done this alone." Ruth held her gaze. "No," she said. "But someone had to know which pieces to put together." She said it plainly, without flattery, in the way she said everything. As a fact she had confirmed, and was now reporting accurately. "That was you." The meeting with the railway company took place on a Tuesday in late November, in the lawyer's office in Billings, around a table with 4 ranchers on one side and 2 railway representatives on the other. Eleanor sat beside Caleb. Thomas Greer sat to Caleb's left, and beyond him the Henderson brothers and Margaret Parrish, a woman of 62 who had run her ranch alone for 8 years since her husband's death, and who, when the railway's lead representative tried to address the group through Caleb exclusively, said quietly and without raising her voice, "You'll want to look at all of us when you speak." The representative looked at all of them after that. Eleanor did not speak for the first 40 minutes. She listened with the cataloging attention she had spent 4 years hiding, tracking every number, every proposed term, every carefully constructed phrase that was designed to look generous while building in a mechanism for later adjustment. She made notes in the small ledger she had brought, not hidden, set openly on the table in front of her. When the railway's lead representative put the first formal offer on the table, Eleanor picked it up and read it twice. She set it down. She said, "The easement lease terms, as written, have a renewal clause in the 3rd paragraph that defaults to railway discretion after the initial 10-year period. We would require mutual consent renewal with a fair market adjustment provision." The representative looked at her. He looked at the lawyer. He looked back at her. "That's a significant ask." "It's a standard ask for any easement lease with a long-term infrastructure investment," she said calmly. "Your own company's land agreements in the Dakota Territory include that provision. I reviewed 2 of them in the public record before this meeting." The silence in the room had a particular quality. The lawyer covered a smile with his hand. The revised terms came back across the table 40 minutes later. Eleanor read them. She asked for 2 additional adjustments, both minor, both legitimate, both accepted with minimal discussion. The lawyer witnessed the signatures. All 4 landowners signed. The railway representatives shook hands with each of them, and when the lead representative shook Eleanor's hand, he held it a half-second longer than the others, and said, with the slightly stunned precision of a man recalibrating an assumption in real time, "You've done this before, Mrs. Horne." "Mrs. Marsh," she said pleasantly, "and no, this is the first time I've done it with my own name on the page." On the ride back from Billings, the sky was wide and gray, and the first real cold of winter was moving down from the mountains with the particular seriousness of a season that meant what it said. Eleanor sat beside Caleb in the wagon, with a wool blanket over her knees and the signed copy of the easement lease in the leather case in her lap. They rode for a while without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that silence becomes comfortable between people who have stopped needing to fill it. "Margaret Parrish," Eleanor said eventually. "What about her?" "She knew the water rights argument before I explained it. She knew the exact boundaries of her husband's original claim." Eleanor looked at the road ahead. "She's been waiting for someone to bring the pieces together for 8 years. "She has," Caleb said. "I want to ask her if she would be willing to speak with the other women in the valley, the ones whose husbands are fielding these offers, and who are sitting at kitchen tables at night looking at documents they haven't been given reason to understand." She paused. They should understand. Caleb glanced at her. You're going to organize the Valley women. I'm going to make sure they have access to information they already have a right to, she said. There's a distinction. There is, he agreed. And she could hear in his voice the thing she had learned to hear there. The sound of a man who was not surprised, who had in fact anticipated something of this shape, who found it not alarming, but fitting. Exactly fitting. When they came over the rise and the ranch appeared below them, the house solid against the gray sky, the barn behind it, the fence lines running out in all directions across land that had water rights and clean records and a recorded easement, and 4 neighbors who had stood at the same table, Eleanor felt the settling in her chest that she had stopped trying to analyze and had simply started accepting as the compass finding north. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate. He sat for a moment, looking at the house. She looked at him, looking at it, at the particular expression on his face, the one she had learned to read over 6 weeks of mornings and evenings and long nights at the lamp. The expression of a man who had built something out of grief and stubbornness and 7 years of solitary fencing, and was now looking at it and finding it had become, in some way he had not designed, genuinely full. I need to fix the north fence before the snow comes, he said. Eleanor looked at him. Is the fence actually broken? A pause. No, he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at the house. Then come inside, she said. There's work to do. He climbed down. She climbed down. He took her hand as they walked through the gate, not to help her, not to guide her, simply to hold it. And she held his in return, with the same plain, unadorned intention. And Scout ran 3 circles around both of them, and then ran ahead to the door. Inside, the house was warm from the morning fire, and the lamp was still burning low on the table, and the ledgers were stacked neatly in the order Eleanor had built them. 4 years of Montana land made legible, made defensible, made permanent. Eleanor set the leather case on the table. She opened it and took out the signed easement lease and placed it in the tin box on the shelf, next to the original land grant, next to Caleb's letters, next to the documents that told the story of this land and who had chosen to stand on it. She closed the box. She turned around. Caleb was watching her from across the room with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes holding the particular steady light of a man who had lost the most important thing in his life, and then, without planning to, without daring to expect it, had found that the ground under his feet was still solid, and that there was someone standing on it beside him who had chosen to be there with her whole self and her whole mind and her whole considerable will. You came here with $43, he said quietly, and a forged letter. I did, she said. And you stayed. She looked at him across the warm, quiet room. This man who had said, "You don't have to pretend with me" on the very first day, and had meant it every day since. Who had built 1,000 yards of fence against his grief and opened his door to a hollow, dry-eyed woman from Cincinnati and given her a table to work at and a tin box full of documents to defend, and the first honest ground she had stood on in 4 years. I stayed, she said, because this is mine, and because you are the first person who ever made me feel that those 2 things were the same. Outside, the first snow of winter came down soft and steady over Ridge Creek Valley, over the creek with its recorded rights, and the fence lines with their patient history, and the 4 ranches holding the corridor that no one was taking from them. And inside the house the fire burned and the lamp burned, and Eleanor Marsh, not hollow now, not pretending, not running toward the farthest name on any board, stood in the home she had chosen with the man who had chosen her back. And for the first time and longer than she could precisely remember, she was exactly where she had decided to be. And that was not the beginning of something. That was the thing itself.